Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 802, and today is May 23rd, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. If you haven't already, be sure you're subscribed to my other program, The Kyle Anzalone Show. The link is the first one in the show notes page. It's the most helpful if you could subscribe to us over on YouTube. We also publish a show at Rumble and, of course, stream it live to my X account at @KyleAnzalone_, and also over on my Facebook page. So lots of ways you can watch that show. And then on Monday, we're going to have a special episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. Actually, two episodes. The normal 4:45 episode, John Hoffman will be making his first appearance on the Kyle Anzalone Show. But first, at 3 p.m. Eastern on Monday, I will have the great Scott Horton returning to the show. So certainly we will have a lot to talk about, a lot to break down. But for today, I want to jump right into the news because I got a lot to talk about. First up here, Europe may use fighter jets to down Russian drones, missiles in Ukraine. So this is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on May 20th. European members of the North Atlantic Alliance are considering a plan that could see them send fighter jets into Ukraine and operate in Ukrainian airspace while they shoot down Russian drones and missiles. Sources familiar with the discussions told Al Jazeera that the proposal, dubbed Sky Shield, would put NATO planes and pilots into Ukrainian airspace for the first time, sending a powerful political message to Russia that Europe is committed to Ukraine's defense. The plan was first reported in February. As many as 120 NATO aircraft will need to take part in this operation, which would be carried out by members separately from the alliance. And so it wouldn't be conducted under NATO. And the U.S. has already made clear if Europeans deploy their forces to Ukraine to defend Ukrainians, then that wouldn't necessarily invoke Article 5 if one of these jets were shot down. London and Kiev jointly worked up the design for the mission, while it is intended to be implemented to enforced during a future ceasefire. The source said it could operate in combat conditions as well. U.S. forces will not participate in Sky Shield, according to Al Jazeera, and it remains unclear which nations are going to take part. The aircraft would be based in Poland and Romania and shoot down missiles along Ukraine's Black Sea coast, which Kiev hopes would free up Ukrainian forces to focus on the front lines. A commander in the Greek Air Force questioned the cost of the proposal and its chances of success. So a colonel in the Hellenic or Greek Air Force told Al Jazeera, "We'd have to pay for the people to be there, several ships a day in all specialties. It will be exhausting." On the other hand, the proposal downplays the effectiveness of air defense systems, which are effective against cruise missiles and have a far lower hourly operating cost than the aircraft. And so this is something that we've seen somewhat, like, I guess in the past year, where we transferred these F-16s to Ukraine, but Ukraine is just using them to try to shoot down Russian missiles. Now, the West has sent a lot of air defense systems to Ukraine, but Ukraine says they still need quite a bit more. The U.S. is in the process of transferring a retired Patriot system for Israel, although it does need to be upgraded first, so that's going to take some time. And they're trying to get the Greeks or the Germans to send a second Patriot battery, but still, this is going to be far short of what the Ukrainians need. I think they're looking for like 10 new batteries, and so this is not going to be anywhere near there. And of course, it seems at this point that it costs far more to down missiles than to launch them. And so from the Russian perspective, this is bleeding the Western economies when they're putting their air defense systems and giving them away to Ukraine. And of course, there's not endless stockpiles of these either. So there's limited numbers of Patriot, THAAD, and other missile defense systems. And so the more we transfer to Ukraine, the less there could be in other parts of the world. And this is going to create shortages at some point. And so I think the reason they're looking at Sky Shield is an acknowledgement that the West has probably stretched itself fairly thin on how many Patriots it could send to Ukraine. Remember, there are numerous countries, including Taiwan, who are waiting for their own Patriot systems. I think Taiwan is trying to upgrade their entire Patriot system into the PAC-3 system, which is the newest upgrade of it. And so either we're going to be asking Taiwan, Poland, and other countries to wait years and years and years to receive their batteries, or we're not going to be able to get them to Ukraine anymore because, as new things become available, everything's being shifted to the Ukrainians. I mean, the Biden administration is even buying Patriots from Japan. I think they're produced by Mitsubishi there. And then we're using that to free up our domestically made Patriots to send to Ukraine. So you can see the real supply chain shortages that we're dealing with here and the logistical hoops that we're willing to jump through. And I think that's why, they're looking to use the aircraft, even as this Greek general says, it's not particularly efficient or cost effective. So NATO members, led by the U.S., have sent multiple ground-based missile defense systems and several F-16s to Ukraine to help defend against Russian missiles targeting its troops and cities. However, Ukrainian officials say they need significantly more air defense assistance. The Greek colonel explained, it's also not really the job of aircraft to hunt down cruise missiles. They can't do it if they are given the coordinates by Air Command. They could go out on flight patrol, spot them by chance. You need a very thick radar array to cover a given area, especially at low altitude. So the Greek military commander also expressed concern for the fallout if a Western aircraft were to go down while defending Ukraine. If one European plane falls and the pilot is killed, it will be very, very difficult for European governments to explain it. For a Greek pilot to go down and get killed in Ukraine could bring down the government. And so what he's saying is not even because the U.S. have expressed this wouldn't invoke an Article 5. This wouldn't lead to direct NATO-Russian warfare if European troops in Ukraine without the U.S. approval end up getting killed. This isn't something that's going to draw the U.S. into war. At least that's what Trump has said. I'm still concerned about it, but at least that's what Trump has said. But what this Greek colonel is saying is forget about that. If our planes start going down, our people are going to be pissed. They're going to protest and they're going to demand a new government take over our country. And, that means like a new election and the old government going out, a new government coming in. And we've seen this several times in Europe where a lot of European leaders have lost and to candidates who are far less hawkish against Russia over the past 3 years. And I think Joe Biden is probably a casualty of that, and there's probably more to come as well. All right, so second article here on Ukraine. Putin says Russia will create buffer zone along Ukrainian border. So Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday said that Russian forces have been instructed to create a buffer zone along the Ukraine-Russia border as fighting continues to rage despite President Trump's push for a peace deal. So Putin said to members of his government, I have already said that the decision was made to create the necessary security buffer zone along the border. Our armed forces are currently solving this problem. Enemy firing points are being actively suppressed and work is underway. Putin previously floated the idea of creating a buffer zone in March during a visit to Russia's Kursk Oblast, which was invaded by Ukrainian forces last year. Russian forces have pushed out the invading Ukrainian troops, but Kursk and other border regions frequently come under Ukrainian shelling and drone attacks. And so we will see what Russia is actually looking at doing here. It's very easy to say, oh, we need a buffer zone. We need to create a buffer zone. This is a very long border. This would be a very large task. This is something that maybe could be achieved at the negotiating table if Russia was willing to maybe made some concessions in southern Ukraine. They say they're not going to take the territory they don't control there, and then demand that territory that they don't control, but that is in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and then in these northern areas, as for a buffer zone where Ukraine would have to have a demilitarized area, maybe that could be some kind of reasonable compromise out of this. If not, if Putin's just planning on creating these through military force, it's probably going to cost a lot of Russian soldiers' lives, money. It will not be cheap for Russia. All right, so next up here, Netanyahu says Trump's ethnic cleansing plan is a condition to end the Gaza war. So on Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said President Trump's plan to remove the Palestinians' population from Gaza was a condition to ending Israel's genocidal war on the besieged territory. He said, I am prepared to end the war in Gaza under clear conditions that will ensure the safety of Israel, all the hostages come home. Hamas lay down its arms, steps down from power. Its leaders expelled from the Strip. Gaza is totally disarmed, and we will carry out the Trump plan, a plan that is so correct and revolutionary. Trump has repeatedly called for the removal of the Palestinian population from Gaza as a part of his plan for the U.S. to take over the territory, and has previously said there would be no right of return for the Palestinians. Netanyahu's comments on Wednesday marked the first time that he said the expulsion of the Palestinian population was a condition to end the war. Now, he has said several times that he wants to do that, but it is important that this is the first time that he is explicitly saying it. And it's always important to mark these top Israeli officials when they're making their very explicit genocidal comments. So often in the United States, the defenders of Zionism are often far more, they're going to say, oh, the Israeli government would do that. They're not doing that. And the Israeli government is explicitly saying that this is a genocide. And they're claiming, where'd you hear that? This is anti-Semitic. Well, how could it be anti-Semitic if the Jewish leader of Israel is the one saying it, and that's who I'm quoting? You just don't like what he's saying, and so you're using anti-Semitism to, prevent you from having to do any deep thought on what Israel's actually doing in Gaza. Next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, May 22nd. Netanyahu, Trump told me I have absolute commitment to you. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said at a press conference on Wednesday that President Trump had assured him that the U.S. was committed to Israel despite a slew of media reports that have said there are friction between the two leaders. Let me give you some details that perhaps haven't been made in public. A few days ago, I think around 10 days ago, maybe a little more, I spoke with President Donald Trump on the phone. And he told me, literally, Bibi, I want you to know, I have absolute commitment to you. I have absolute commitment to the state of Israel. Netanyahu also said he spoke with Vice President J.D. Vance. Vance said, listen, don't pay attention to all these fake news spins out there about the rupture between us. He said it's all spin. This isn't the truth. It's not true. I'm telling you from our side, it's not true. And of course, all the weapons that the U.S. has shipped to Israel and Trump signing off on, offering to pay for, and helping the ethnic cleansing of Gaza makes it very clear that this is actually the case. Next up, UN says no aid distributed in Gaza. So, the UN said on Tuesday, and I have read that they have continued to say this throughout the week, that while aid trucks have been allowed to enter the Gaza side of the Karim Shalom border crossing, its teams have been unable to access and distribute the shipments. A UN spokesman said, today, one of our teams waited several hours for Israel to greenlight access to the Karim Shalom area and collect the nutrition supplies. Unfortunately, they were not able to bring those supplies into our warehouse. So just to make it clear, while more supplies have come into the Gaza Strip, we have not been able to secure the survival of those supplies into our warehouses and delivery points. And so far, only 4 trucks of baby food have been dropped off on the Gaza side of the border on Monday, and a few dozen trunks of flour, medicine, other basic goods were able to enter Gaza on Tuesday. And look, a lot of these trucks, you're going to need a lot more that's entering. This is a literal drop of in the ocean when it comes to what Gaza is needed versus what's being allowed in. So Pope Leo XIV renews call for Gaza ceasefire and end to the Israeli blockade on aid. This is some good news. The old Pope is taking up where the previous Pope left off when it comes to Gaza. And of course, with the change in the papacy, there has been additional attention paid to what the new Pope is saying, and that he's making such a big deal of this early on in his time as Pope, I think is incredibly important. So on Wednesday, he renewed his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and for Israel to allow humanitarian aid to enter the Palestinian territory. He said the situation in Gaza is increasingly worrying and painful. I renew my appeal to allow the entry of dignified humanitarian aid and put an end to the hostilities whose heartbreaking price is paid by the children, elderly, and the sick. Israel imposed a total blockade on Gaza on May 2nd, and it March 2nd, and in recent days has allowed a small number of Trumps to enter the enclave. However, according to the latest reports, no aid has reached the starving population. The UN said on Tuesday night that teams were unable to access the Gaza side of the Karim Shalom border crossing. And so again, Israel controls large swaths of Gaza, and so they could bring in thousands of trucks into Gaza and park them in these areas. And if Israel doesn't allow the aid agencies to access these trucks to get to the flour, the baby food, and everything else carried on them, then it's really not going to help the people whatsoever. And so this seems more like a public relations stunt than an actual act of humanitarianism. And the Israeli leadership has made it clear that's the case. Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who everybody likes to dismiss as, oh yeah, he's an extreme right-wing figure. He's an important and powerful member of the coalition government. Trump's Treasury Secretary was some lunatic, and that was all, he's just some fringe figure. The Treasury Secretary, the finance minister, has massive amounts of power. And of course, Smotrich has even more power. He's been given the power to annex over 60% of the West Bank, Area C. He could just say that this Palestinian home right here, all of your documentation that proves, your deed, your title to your house is absolutely worthless. And in fact, I'm going to reassign this as state Israeli land and give it to a Jewish family. This is the power that man has. And to just dismiss him as some fringe element of the coalition is absurd. Also, after 3 years of him, over 3.5 years of him being in this coalition with Netanyahu now, it seems, I guess 2.5, it seems relatively clear that not only is Smotrich powerful but influential, and what he has been saying all along is what's turning out to be true. And so we need to take this man's statements very seriously, even if he is a genocidal lunatic. Now, moving on to the West Bank, we had a couple, I think, really important stories here. Israeli military fired near European diplomats who diverted from pre-approved route. So a delegation of diplomats visiting the West Bank were fired at with warning shots by the Israeli military on Wednesday. The Israeli military said the delegation had deviated from the approved route and entered an area where they were not authorized to be, and that the soldiers fired warning shots to distance them away. So again, this is not the Palestinian reporting of this incident. This is what the IDF, this is what Tel Aviv is saying to justify firing warning shots at international delegation. People from all over Europe, from the Middle East, who were in Jenin to see the destruction that Israel had leveled on that place. And when we talk about warning shots here, I could understand maybe somebody thinks that one soldier maybe just fired a couple rounds into the air and it was meant to draw attention rather than actually turning somebody around. But you can see, I can't play the video here. I'm sure it's too violent and YouTube would take it down, but you could see in the video, if you go to my article, the one I link and watch it, the Israeli soldiers are not firing in the air. They are firing above the heads of the diplomats, but it was a fairly violent act. So the footage shows the diplomats speaking with the press before gunfire forces them to run for cover. UK and France led a number of European countries that summoned Israeli ambassadors to protest the IDF actions. The French foreign minister wrote on X, "A visit to Jenin, which was one of our diplomats was participating in, was fired upon by Israeli soldiers. This is unacceptable. The Israeli ambassador will be summoned to explain." The delegation's trip to the West Bank comes as Tel Aviv is moving forward with a series of laws and decrees that give Israel severe sovereignty over half of the region. The West Bank was key to a two-state solution. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, is set to hold significant authority over the West Bank under the new regime. His plan for the West Bank, as he previously put it, includes giving Palestinians the choice between subjugation, emigration, and death. Smotrich has repeatedly advocated for lethal force to be even used against Palestinian children. And so this man is a sick lunatic who will have now the massive power over the Palestinian people in the West Bank. And of course, he has said from the time he entered the Netanyahu government, from the time that coalition was formed, not after October 7th, but in December of 2022, so a full 10 months before October 7th happened, Smotrich was saying that his involvement in the defense ministry, in the Netanyahu government, there was an agreed upon plan to end the West Bank, and part of that, October 7th just gave them political ability in Israel to include Gaza as well as the West Bank in their annexation plans. So this is truly disgusting. And just remember that this happens, and then 2 Israeli officials were killed on the streets in Washington, D.C., right? And this is a horrible act, let me say. And for people who are maybe, saying that we shouldn't be empathetic to the Israelis that were killed because their government is in the middle of a genocide, just understand how much this sets back our argument that the Palestinians deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And yes, a Palestinian isn't guilty of that. I 100% agree with that. But whenever you have a nonviolent movement, and many, for all the smears that all of us take across the country, oh, you're just pro-Hamas, you just hate the Jews, right? This is what we hear time and time again. In many protest movement, these campus protest movement, the people who advocate for the Palestinians are always very careful not to say anything anti-Semitic, to accept and embrace particularly non-Zionist Jews, right? And not to engage in any violence whatsoever, even if violence is being perpetrated against them, as we saw like in UCLA in the United States. This is what I think has moved everything in such a positive direction. One of the clips making the rounds on social media over the past couple of days is Piers Morgan, who was an Israeli fanatic, an absolute lunatic for the first 18 months of this, who, I don't want to say like he was as genocidal as Bezalel Smotrich or anything like that, but was certainly, telling his audience and giving Israel the blank check that they would need to do what they did. And he is now admitting that he was wrong, that what Israel is doing here has no military justification, that they're just killing civilians. And he told Mehdi Hassan that, Mehdi, you were right about what Israel has been trying to do in Gaza. And I think the reason that there are so many people, Theo Von is another person who, not like Piers Morgan, who was ever bad on this, but he was a comedian. He wasn't somebody who was necessarily involved in foreign policy or would care or spend a lot of time talking about that. But he now put out this very, I think, heartfelt and sincere message saying, what are we doing? How are we allowing this to happen? This genocide that we're all witnessing every day, how are we allowing it to happen? And I think that movement is because there's been so many of us non-violently making so much noise, just reporting the facts and trying our best to bring attention to the issue. And so when you had this shooting occur in Washington, D.C. with 2 Israeli staffers being killed, I think it's really going to set that back some. And so, this is absolutely awful, not just for the 2 people that were killed, their families, but also for the Palestinians and their movement, who I think are going to have less support in the U.S. now. Of course, there is a very unfair double standard here. There have been there's a Palestinian child that was killed in Chicago. There were 3 Muslims, I don't even know if they were actually Palestinian, who were shot in Vermont because of this. And nobody blames Israel. Nobody blames the genocide. I shouldn't say nobody, some people do, but in the mainstream media, in the U.S. mainstream political discourse, nobody is blaming Israel for this. Nobody is talking about the genocidal rhetoric of Netanyahu, saying that the Palestinians are Amalek, talking about Yoav Gallant, saying that the Palestinians are human animals, Bezalel Smotrich, who actually has advocated for segregated maternity wards. Just the most absurd kind of racism is what he's advocated for. Itmar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, has called for bombing the food warehouses when there was still food left in Gaza. So this kind of depravity, right? Nobody is blaming the Israeli officials for these people in the United States carrying out these murderous acts. And yet when it's the flip side, then, I see people blaming Dave Smith and Candace Owens for it. It's absolutely absurd. All right, so next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, May 22nd, antiwar.com. Representative Randy Fine implies Gaza should be nuked like Japan after DC's shootings. So on Thursday, Representative Randy Fine appeared to suggest that Gaza should be nuked like Japan was during World War II in response to the shootings in Washington, D.C. that killed 2 Israeli embassy staffers. The congressman was asked in an interview on Fox News if the shooting should change the course of Israel's onslaught in Gaza. Fine said, "Well, I think it speaks to the importance of the only end of the conflict is the complete and total surrender of those who support Muslim terror. In World War II, we did not negotiate a surrender with Nazis. We did not negotiate a surrender with Japanese. We nuked Japan twice in order to get an unconditional surrender. That needs to be the same here." And so not only is that just ahistorical and very stupid, but also advocating for a current genocide, which is problematic. Fine, who recently won a special election for Mike Waltz's seat in the House, and who would have ever thought you would want Mike Waltz back in Congress, is staunchly pro-Israel and has a history of calling for mass violence against the Palestinians. He celebrated the Israeli military killing of a 26-year-old Turkish-American citizen who was gunned down in the West Bank during a protest, calling her a Muslim terrorist even though she was unarmed. Fine has also said in the interview on Thursday that Palestinianism is violence and that Palestinianism is evil. The shooting on Wednesday night killed a young couple, an Israeli citizen and an American woman, as they were walking out of a Young Diplomats event at the Capital Jewish Museum. The suspect is not Palestinian and has been identified as Elas Rodriguez, a 31-year-old from Chicago. A purported manifesto he wrote shows that Gaza was his motive for the attack, and Rodriguez was seen shouting "Free Palestine" as he was arrested. Now, I don't think we know a lot about this person yet. Maybe he's severely mentally ill and just, kind of got caught up in what was happening online. And that's what, caused him to carry out this violent act. But whatever it was, this obviously does not help the Palestinian people. These, were the first people that, Israelis killing the United States. But it's not something that is going to in any way benefit the Palestinians, right? All right, moving on here before we wrap up, want to mention this about Iran. Iran's Ayatollah says U.S. demand about nuclear enrichment is nonsense. So the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, on Tuesday called the U.S. demands for Iran to eliminate its civilian nuclear enrichment program as nonsense, and said he doesn't think negotiations with the U.S. would bring results. And so it's, this is further just kind of getting into what is actually happening behind the scenes here. What are the Americans telling the Iranians? Because they're agreeing to more and more rounds of talks. But if the talks are really just about Iran giving up its nuclear enrichment program, then I think it's unlikely that Iran would agree to the talks. And so I think privately, the U.S. is saying far more realistic things to the Iranians than they're saying publicly. And this is the Ayatollah's, I guess, response here to try to get the U.S. to bring in line their public and private positions and really try to suss out and figure out what exactly the Americans are saying. Now, there are some reports that we're getting that Israel is planning an attack on Iran, and as soon as the talks with the U.S. fall apart, Israel is going to attack. I'm not sure that this report is true. It may be the Israelis are making these threats because they don't want the talks to progress. Israel definitely doesn't want a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran, because then a lot of the Israeli arguments as why the U.S. needs to give unconditional support to Israel start to fade away. And so this is, all really interesting and really important. I don't know what's going on with the Iran talks, but I will be speaking with Scott Horton and John Hoffman about them on Monday, and hopefully they could give us more insight. So everybody subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Be sure to subscribe and you share out this show. Do everything you can to help me out, help to grow this show, as well as just checking out my articles. I write the email for the Institute, so you can subscribe to the Libertarian Institute email list and then get like a little kind of Kyle's hot take every day in your inbox, me talking about what I think are some of the most important issues, a little bit more opinionated than my typical news story. So if you like my work, you'll probably enjoy those, and we'll be back with more episodes next week.